All right, everybody, I've been wanting to make this video for such a long time, literally months and months. I actually recorded it about 2 months ago, but I got entirely through it, realized I'd forgotten to turn on my microphone, and I've not had a chance to come back and try this again. So fingers crossed, this is going to be the final run here, and I can finally cover this topic once and for all. So what I want to cover here today is less around a how-to tutorial with Lightroom and more so about the ecosystem itself that Adobe has built within the Lightroom universe, for lack of a better way to put it. And really where we're at today is there's a lot of confusion out there. And as I peruse social media, Reddit, things like that, almost daily I come across questions or confusion around this Lightroom ecosystem. And really what it comes down to is several years ago, Adobe rolled out this subscription-based model with Lightroom. Today you've got Lightroom and Lightroom Classic. Right there, you can see where some of the confusion comes in if somebody's just searching for Lightroom tutorials, tips, tricks, things of that nature. So the names are very similar, but again, it's confusing. Do they serve the same purpose? What are the differences? Is one better than the other? Lightroom Classic, that sounds old, a classic car, a classic album, things like that. The fact that I said album is classic. But does that mean Lightroom Classic is going to go away in the near future? A lot of people assume it is, or that it's no longer supported, which isn't actually the case. So what I want to cover here is some of the common questions and confusion points that come up around these two versions of Lightroom. Share a little bit around the differences between the two of them. Now I'm not going to go real deep dive on this one. Actually what I did here is about 6 weeks ago I put up a blog post where I do go into a pretty in-depth list of the differences between Lightroom Cloud, as I call it, and Lightroom Classic. So for all the details, I do highly recommend you check that out. I'll drop the link down below. So I'm going to cover here the top few reasons as to why I use one version or the other. It's going to be based on my use case, my personal needs in terms of the Lightroom ecosystem. Yours are going to be a little bit different perhaps, but I want to cover some of these key things here because some of them are fairly universal in terms of some of the tools and functionality available in one version or the other. So first things first, let's just get the naming debacle out of the way. Lightroom Classic does not equal, or Classic doesn't equal going away, old, outdated, what have you. It is the older version of Lightroom. It's the legacy version of Lightroom, but it's still fully supported by Adobe. A lot of people assume that the Lightroom Cloud version, the newer version, is going to be the replacement for Lightroom Classic. Now, me being a somewhat logical person, I like to think that stands to reason that eventually, yeah, maybe Adobe will get it back to just one version of Lightroom, and Classic eventually won't necessarily go away, but they'll just kind of blend together and we'll have one nice, simple, clearly named version of Lightroom again like we've had in the past. That said, the differences are so vast, I don't think that day is going to be here anytime soon. So with that long-winded introduction out of the way, let me just say, if you find this helpful, please do give the video a thumbs up. I want to be a YouTube guy if I didn't say that. Subscribe to the channel. If you want to follow along as I continue to release new videos in the future, turn on that bell notification also so you get notified when new videos come out as well. Shameless self-promotion out of the way, let's jump in here. I guess let's just start with a high-level overview between the two versions. So again, you've got Lightroom versus Lightroom Classic. Lightroom is the more modern version. It's the version that came out in 2017 when they went to the subscription model. It is based around a cloud-centric model, meaning that all of your images are stored in the Adobe Creative Cloud. You can't really use the platform at all unless you're intending to use that cloud service as a backup photo storage solution, whatever. I don't recommend treating it as a backup. That is really the core intent of it. Whereas Lightroom Classic, all of your images are stored locally. You retain full control over where you store them, what drives you store them on, how many drives you store them on, how you back them up, all of that stuff. And it's also a far more robust solution for asset management from a file organization standpoint and things of that nature. And then again, as we go through this, you'll see that it also has quite a few additional tools and features that aren't in the newer Lightroom Cloud-centric or Lightroom Cloud version. So looking at the Cloud version specifically, it does have some nice things built into it that aren't necessarily available in Classic. One of those is built-in learning tutorials. Maybe tutorials isn't quite the right term, but essentially they've got step-throughs that you can view from other photographers and people like that built into the platform itself so that you can go see how the different tools and functionality work within the Lightroom interface. They've got AI-based search tools, so if you're searching for images with mountains in them in Lightroom Classic, all you can do is rely on any manually entered keywords to find images with mountains. With the cloud-centric version of Lightroom, it's all AI-based. So if you're looking for all of your images with mountains in them or all of your images with trees in them, it's all AI-based, so you just type in that keyword and it's going to use artificial intelligence to scan through all of your images that you've got stored in the Creative Cloud to find the ones with that particular keyword. Pretty nice feature that's not in Classic. It's also really centered around, because it is based on that cloud environment, it's very heavily centered around sharing and collaboration. There's actually a Lightroom community feature that's built into it where you can share not only your images, but how you edited those images. And it's kind of slick. It does a quick walkthrough step-by-step of basically all of the slider settings and how you tweaked every individual component of the image to come up with the end result. A cool little thing, I've got some images out there. That's one of the reasons I do use the cloud version of Lightroom. Another cool thing that just added with the June of 2021 release is collaboration. Again, exclusive to the cloud version of Lightroom, you now have a collaboration feature where you can actually invite other people to come in and collaborate with you on editing your images, whether it be a single image or a group of images. Simply invite them in. They can not only view it, but also edit it along with you or for you, and you can work collaboratively through the cloud environment. On top of all that, since it is obviously a new platform, it's got a more modern code base. So for some people, and I cover this in my Lightroom performance recommendations video, for some people, this version of Lightroom might be the way to go if you've got an older system or a less powerful system and you're really having some performance struggles with Lightroom Classic. You might give it a go with the cloud version of Lightroom because it is running on that more modern code. So something to keep in mind there too. Now, comparing that to Lightroom Classic, which has been around since 2007, don't quote me on that, but I think that's right. Now, first of all, for anybody that's been using Lightroom or has used Lightroom in the past, it is the tried and true familiar Lightroom that, again, has been around for over a decade. It's the user interface you're used to. Everything is in there in terms of tools and functionality that you might be used to using. And actually, it's far more robust overall compared to Lightroom Cloud. And in fact, if you go out and look at the blog post that I put out there about 6 weeks ago on my site, there's about 25, roughly 24 differences, key differences in my opinion, between the two versions. When I say key differences, it really leans towards a couple dozen features and tools that are in Lightroom Classic that just simply don't exist in the newer version of Lightroom. That seems counterintuitive. You would think the newer version would have the most stuff. That's not the case. Again, it's got a little bit different target audience with the way they're using the cloud storage and collaboration and things like that versus Classic, which is really your traditional powerhouse version of Lightroom. Now, all that said, I'm not going to go through all those differences because otherwise this video would probably end up over an hour and I don't want to bore you to death. So what I'm going to do here is cover really my top 5 reasons for why I stick with Lightroom Classic. You may have different needs and you find that Lightroom Cloud is more than sufficient for those needs. But again, check out the blog post, not to spam you with pushing you to the blog post, but that's where you're going to get your full list of differences, features, tool sets, et cetera, that exist in Classic that aren't in the cloud version, so you can make a fully informed decision. Let's just jump in here to the 5 reasons why I prefer Lightroom Classic over Lightroom Cloud. All right, so we'll just do a little bit of a countdown here. How about? So reason number 5 for why I recommend or I prefer Lightroom Classic over the Lightroom Cloud version. Number 5 is plugin support. As it stands today in summer of 2021, the cloud-centric version or Lightroom Cloud does not support any type of plugins. So for me personally, I've got the TOPAZ Labs AI-based tools that are available. So TOPAZ DeNoise, AI sharpening, the Gigapixel one for enlarging images. All of that is built into Lightroom Classic and Photoshop as plugins, but not within the Lightroom Cloud version. So you've got to kind of do an end around to get the files into those TOPAZ tools and then bring them into the Lightroom Cloud version as well. Whereas if you do it in Lightroom Classic, you can quote unquote round trip it. You right click on the image, open it in the TOPAZ tool of your choice or another plugin of your choice. And then when you save it, it automatically pulls it back into Lightroom Classic, no extra steps involved. So number 5 on that one, I don't use those tools frequently, but I use them often enough that I don't want to have to jump through extra hoops when it comes time to take advantage of one of those tools. Number 4, limited options on the edit and Photoshop tools within both versions of Lightroom. With Lightroom Cloud, you can right-click on an image and choose Edit in Photoshop, but that is the only option you've got. Whereas typically for me, I do at least 99% of my editing all within Lightroom Classic, but when I do want to use Photoshop, it's because I'm doing blends of multiple images, probably either a focus stack or it's a more detailed exposure blend than what I can do with the HDR tool within Lightroom for blending multiple frames together. So I want to open those in Photoshop as layers. From the Lightroom Cloud version, that's not an option. For whatever reason, they haven't built that in or added that in yet. Lightroom Classic, you select multiple images, hit right click on any of them, and you've got an option for edit in Photoshop as layers. Boom, there it goes. It loads them right in. Do your blending that you need to, save the image, and it pops it back into Lightroom for you. Number 3, there's very limited ability to manage your printing within Lightroom Cloud. In Lightroom Classic, you've got soft proofing. There's an entire dedicated print module. Now, again, this is something that's very specific to my needs today. A few months ago, I didn't need it, but I didn't have this thing sitting back here in terms of my new shiny toy and printer. So now this is very important to me. Right now, Lightroom Cloud is very, very limited. You can basically just print. Within Lightroom Classic, you've got soft proofing, which lets you preview how the images are going to look on different types of paper, different printers, ink types, so on and so forth. And you've got the entire print module, so you can do proofing sheets with multiple images on them, change the margins, borders, add text, add information. So for me now, this print stuff is huge, and I've got to use Lightroom Classic for that. I wouldn't be able to do anything that I'm doing today to make sure my prints are coming out as I want them within the cloud version of Lightroom. Number 4, this one kind of boggles my mind, is the history panel. In Lightroom Classic, you've got the lovely list of all of your history steps in terms of everything you've done in adjusting your image. On top of that, you've got the snapshot feature, which lets you take snapshots of points in time of your edit as well. So you can jump to a particular snapshot. Maybe you've gone 20 steps further in your edit and you realize, you know what, that snapshot that I saved an hour ago is really, kind of the point I want to be at. You just go to your snapshot and pull it up and you're good to go. Again, boggles my mind, but Lightroom Cloud doesn't even have a history panel. You can step back and step back and step back. You don't have a snapshot feature. You don't have a list of all your history steps to just go through and find the exact part you want to go back to and say, you know what, everything I just did, forget about that. I want to go all the way back to this particular step and start working from there again. You got to be in Classic to have that kind of feature. Doesn't seem like it'd be a real big deal, but it drives me nuts when I'm trying to do any type of editing within the cloud version of Lightroom and realize I don't have that history panel available. Did I say that was number 4? I was counting backwards. That should have been number 2 if I said it was number 4. Anyways, and the number 1 reason I cannot and will not move over to the Lightroom Cloud version from Classic is range masking on local adjustments. Now, I've put out some tutorials around local adjustments 101 and range masking. I've got a tutorial about how to do the Orton effect all within Lightroom Classic. None of the range masking stuff, including how I use it for the Orton effect piece, is possible within the cloud version of Lightroom as it stands today in summer of 2021. So with range masking, if you're not familiar with it, it allows you to further refine your local adjustments, whether it's a graduated filter, radial filter, or a brush adjustment. It lets you fine tune it based on a color or color range or a luminance range, so the brightness values within the image. So if I'm doing the Orton effect, for instance, if you've watched that tutorial, the key to that is I don't want that kind of soft glowy effect in my shadows because shadows don't glow. To do that in Lightroom Cloud, either it ain't going to happen or I've got to go in and tediously erase out everything from the shadows so that it's only impacting the brighter parts of the image. Whereas in Lightroom Classic, I create the local adjustment that I want with my Orton effect settings, go down to the luminance range mask sliders, dial those in, and bada bing, bada boom, I'm done. Nice and easy. Doesn't exist in Lightroom Cloud. This is something I use on almost every single one of my images is the range mask, whether it's a color range mask or luminance range mask, even if I'm not doing the Orton effect. There's a lot of things I'm doing where I want to do it to very targeted specific areas of the image. Again, either color or the luminosity within the image. So this is a huge one. I'm surprised Adobe hasn't added this into the cloud-centric version of Lightroom just yet because it is such a powerful tool. And again, this is recording as of summer of 2021. I'm sure eventually, as I said at the start of the video, all this stuff's going to kind of start blending together more and more, and range mask will get added to the cloud version of Lightroom as well. But right now, as it stands, it ain't there, and I ain't going to use it because of that, because it would just be way too big of a feature for me to give up. All right, so I just ran through the top 5 reasons for why I'm sticking with Lightroom Classic for the time being. Again, I've got a list of about 24 things that are not in the new cloud version of Lightroom that are in Lightroom Classic. Many of those I feel are very important. Might just be convenience pieces, but some of them are additional tool sets for editing or organization or whatever. So I do, again, I'm going to spam it again. Go check out the blog post for the full list. But I do want to be clear here. It doesn't mean there's not value to the cloud version of Lightroom. It depends on your needs. And that's where I think Adobe does such a disservice to anybody joining the Lightroom ecosystem. And I even see people that are familiar with Lightroom Classic, especially, get confused about the differences. I don't know why they don't spell it out in more detail as to what the benefits of each version are. Again, the cloud version, you've got the collaboration with other people, you've got the community feature, all your stuff stored in the cloud, which some people do rely on as a backup solution. I don't personally recommend treating it as a backup solution because there's multiple factors there. If you want to understand a little bit more about that, go watch my backing up video that I put out last summer. It's going to be better at performance, possibly on some systems, especially underpowered systems. So there are some benefits to the Lightroom Cloud version. It's got a nicer interface, quite honestly. You know, with Lightroom Classic, you can tell it's been around longer. It just doesn't look as modern and clean and sleek as Lightroom Cloud. That also means the cloud version can be a little less intimidating. A, it's got less features, but B, it's a probably a little friendlier interface to it than what you've got in Lightroom Classic. It's also very similar in layout and design to the mobile app for Lightroom and the tablet or iPad app for Lightroom. So if you're bouncing around to the different mobile apps for Lightroom ecosystem, that Lightroom Cloud version on the desktop is going to be somewhat similar and familiar. So I think where I'm at today in 2021 is there's a place for both, and you can use both versions. What I do with the Lightroom ecosystem myself, obviously Lightroom Classic is my main hub. That's where I do all my importing of new images. It's where I export all my images. That's where I set up my prints that I want to make. But I do sync everything up to the Adobe Cloud. And this is the asterisk on Classic, is it's not cloud centric, but you can still leverage the cloud features by syncing your smart previews through your collections up to the Adobe Creative Cloud. Now they are smart previews, meaning they're not going to be your full resolution files like they are in the Lightroom Cloud version, but you can still get them up there with your edits and keywording and all that stuff. And then you can go into Lightroom Cloud and take advantage of the collaboration, the community stuff, and things of that nature. So for me, one of my big things with all of this in the photography space is education and helping others and kind of paying it forward in terms of, you know, I learned from others. I want to pass that along to other new photographers starting out. So I go in and I share my stuff in the community. I don't have a lot out there, but I'm building up more and more, so you can see exactly, hey, these are the slider settings I used and so on and so forth, and learn a little bit from me in that regard. So I'm using the community features there. I use the mobile tools, so I want things synced up to the cloud. You know, I'm not editing on mobile, but I do share images from there. If I'm working on an image, I want to get feedback on the edit and where it's at, see if a friend's got any recommendations or catches anything that I'm missing. I'll export it from the mobile version of Lightroom and kick it off. So by syncing all of my stuff from Lightroom Classic up to the cloud, I'm getting those smart previews out there, and I can take advantage of the Lightroom Cloud desktop app features as well as take advantage of the mobile features. So for me, it's using a mix and match of both versions. Conversely, you can use the Lightroom Cloud as your main hub. If you import all your images into there, then you are going to get the full resolution files up into the Creative Cloud. Now, if you're syncing everything from the Lightroom Cloud version up, you're syncing the full resolution files, which is great, but you may run into the problem of storage capacity. And you don't get a ton of storage, and it's not the cheapest through the Adobe plan, so that is something to consider, but I give a little bit more details and breakdowns of how the different plans can work on their own and together in that blog post. So again, shameless plug, go take a look at that for more details around this stuff. So I hope this has given you at least some ideas to consider if you're new to the Lightroom ecosystem as to which plan to go with, which version to use as your main hub version, or if you're already in the Lightroom ecosystem and you're using the cloud version and you're frustrated because you're trying to find tutorials, but most tutorials like my own are centered around Lightroom Classic still. You know, reasons that you might want to make that switch from the cloud version to Lightroom Classic, or why you might want to switch from Classic to the cloud version. Anyways, there's a lot of things to consider. I've covered my top things here. For the millionth time, go check out the blog for the entire list of things that I've identified as major reasons as to why Lightroom Classic is the way to go. That is my recommendation, it's my preference. But the main point of this is to make sure that you are making a fully informed decision. Again, Adobe does not do a good job of outlining these differences, and they really seem to be pushing the cloud version and kind of like, oh, well, Classic's out here and, you know, here's kind of what it is, but they don't go into the details. And I think that's where a lot of the new users get totally lost and confused, because they just assume, oh, well, this is Lightroom and Classic means old, so I don't want Classic. So if you're one of those people that are trying to make that decision, I hope you found this helpful. If you did, please again, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and also turn on the bell notification so you get notified as I release more videos in the future. And until next time, take care.